So, Alexandria, great to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on and to talk to us about the work you've done around genetic architecture and obesity. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Your research has been focused on genes and to help us improve our understanding of how genes can contribute to the development of obesity. Can you first tell us a bit about the prevalence of obesity? I mean, you looked at it specifically in the United States, so let's talk about that first, and also about how that is predicted to change in the future.
Obesity is sort of on the rise globally, but a lot of the research that I do is pulling from sources from the US, so that's where I have the best statistics from. So a lot of the findings prior to COVID, way back in the before times, indicated that a little over 40% of adults in the US had obesity, and just under 20% of children were also classified as having obesity. And then, of course, increases further than that when you also consider the proportion of people who are overweight. And so, actually, COVID has been a really big issue in terms of obesity and metabolic health, in addition to all the other problems it caused. In some research, it's shown that from 2020 to 2021 alone, so just 1 year, there were increases in about 3% for both adults and children in the rates of obesity. And it's actually sort of accelerated the timeline predictions. So 2019 research suggested that it would be by 2030 that we would start seeing about 50% of adults in the US being considered obese. And I've seen most recently a study from the American Obesity Association suggesting that that could actually be occurring by 2025 at this point. So in 2 or 3 years, depending on how you're looking at the timeline. And, as I said, it's on the rise globally as well. And it is predicted that by in 2025, 1 in 5 adults worldwide will also be classified as obese. So it's a rapidly accelerating disease, and it's harder and harder to stop it.
Mhm. And there are consequences and also costs to obesity, both, well, for the individual as well as
Mhm.
for, the society more at large. Can you talk a bit more about those and, what are the impacts there?
Mhm. There are multiple levels, so personally and societally. The main one that we tend to focus on is medically. For people who have obesity, they have increased risks of other metabolic complications. So, the ones that we hear about the most often are developing type 2 diabetes, high cholesterol, increased risks for cardiovascular disease and strokes. Um, what is also known is that obesity is linked to increased risks of depression and anxiety, increased risks of Alzheimer's and dementia, and it's also been connected to different forms of cancer and decreased fertility as well. And so the main real problem with obesity medically wise is that it's predisposes patients to so many other problems. And that can lead to increased healthcare costs for the individual, particularly if you're in the United States. It's a really big individual problem. But, at a greater level in the government spending, it's a problem for healthcare. And I think globally, about 13.2% of healthcare costs are related to issues from high BMIs. So billions and billions of dollars are being spent on issues related to obesity. Medically, that's not the only problem with obesity. So there's also sort of social stigmas related to patients who have obesity. And so that can be within the medical community. Patients with obesity often feel unheard by their doctors, that they can come in with other issues that really aren't related to their increased weight, and doctors can sort of just say it's just because you're obese, just lose the weight and ignore the problems. That's been a huge issue in healthcare that, hospitals are working harder and harder to try and combat that. But also sort of just in society, being fat is very often seen as a problem with the person, that it's their fault. But being fat is not a personal failing. There is so much that being fat or having obesity is more than what we can control. So there's levels of, our environment, of how accessible is healthy foods, how accessible is getting exercise in a safe way. And then there's social status, where um, people who have, lower socioeconomic status are often associated with increased risk for obesity and poor metabolic health. And then our genetics as well. We don't really have any control over our genetics, but it plays a huge role in whether or not we're at an increased risk for developing obesity.
And so now talking about the genetics and especially, the heritability of obesity, how much do we know about, the genetic architecture underlying the disease? How do we understand that today?
Mhm. We at the same time understand a lot and understand very little of it. So obesity, or the genetics of obesity, are predicted to be about somewhere between 40 to 70% of heritability. So your genes are explaining about that much of the variation. Depending on which study you're looking at, it can be higher or lower. But so at this point in time, we have identified over 900 variants for body mass index, which is the most common stand-in for obesity that we typically use. There's been over 300 variants identified for waist-hip ratio, which is often seen as a more informative measure of obesity related to metabolic health because you're actually looking at visceral obesity. With that, that's still really only explaining about 20% of the variation that we know, less than 20%. Environment plays a really big role as well in ways that we don't understand. And gene and by environment interactions need to be much better studied, in addition to just finding new genes. So overall, I would say we are making progress in understanding the biology of individual obesity-related genes, but the big picture for human health and translating these findings into the clinic is that we need to find new genes. We need to better understand gene by gene interactions as well as gene by environment interactions. And then what type of environmental factors are going to be important? It's not just diet. And so a lot more work is needed to understand all of these relationships, which are, extraordinarily complex. And that's why progress has been, fast, but it's also felt really slow.
And can you talk now a bit about the genes and the pathways associated with obesity
Mhm.
based on, genome-wide association studies?
Yeah. So a lot of the genes and pathways that have been studied for obesity are related to satiety signaling. So a lot of the genes that have been found are enriched in the brain, which makes us think that they're related to our eating behaviors. And so I just want to sort of include a picture of some of the satiety signaling overviews, just so it's a reference. But so when our body is deciding, do we want to eat? Do we want to stop eating? We're getting signals from all over. We're getting signals from the fat. We're getting a lot of signals from the gut, and they're all traveling into the brain. And the main region of interest in the brain has been the hypothalamus. That is not to say that other regions are not important. The hindbrain is gaining a lot of attention in recent years. But for our purposes, we focus a lot on the hypothalamus because that's where most of those satiety signals are being translated. And in the hypothalamus, there are sort of two distinct regions of neurons. The POMC neurons are those that are anorexigenic, so they are the ones that are indicating we are full, stop eating. And a lot of the genes of interest typically lie along these pathways. So the first couple ones that I talk about in the review paper are MC4R, which you can see a little figure for it here, which is the melanocortin-4 receptor. It's a G protein coupled receptor that is responsible for translating the signals from the POMC neurons to these paraventricular neurons down here. And not shown with MC4R is ADCY3, which is a ADCY3, which creates cyclic AMP, which is the secondary messenger that sends out all the signals elsewhere to induce satiety. And it's been shown that dysregulations in MC4R and ADCY3 are associated with increases in obesity. Specific variants are also associated with decreased risks of obesity. So there's good and bad things going on in the genetics. It just depends on luck of the draw. But so these two are really big genes of interest for understanding obesity and satiety signaling. One other gene that's not pictured here is FTO, that is the fat mass and obesity associated gene. So that was actually the first obesity-related gene identified by genome-wide association studies, and it's got the therefore the highest significance of all those genes that we're going to find that way. And that one has been pretty popular. A lot of variants in its first intron have been associated with increased risks of obesity. And specifically, it's been shown to potentially affect how satiety signaling might be incorporated in the CNS in the brain, and predisposition towards what types of food we want to eat, where specific variants have been shown to induce children to want to eat fattier foods.
And so how might better understanding the genetic contributions of this satiety signaling that you've been speaking about and the in the hypothalamus help in the treatment of obesity?
There are, I think, four main things that are really important that research still needs to do. The first one is get a better understanding of the biology of obesity to identify new targets for pharmacotherapeutics, because there are so few options on the market, and there are often long periods of time where we're not getting a whole lot added into the market. It's also important to better understand the genetics and the different variants and how they're associated with obesity. Is when we have patients come into the clinic who have obesity, is getting a sense, okay, you have this variant in this gene, so maybe this is what your risk score is, depending on environmental factors, but also it's potentially connected to how effective will different treatments be. Variations in MC4R, ADCY3, and FTO have actually all been linked to different efficacies in weight loss treatments. And so a patient with a specific variant might be better suited to receiving a treatment different than a different patient with a different variant. And then finally, better understanding just the heterogeneity of obesity is really important to advance the field and help, broaden the understanding that obesity is a disease. It's not a personal failing, as I said before, and we have to start helping patients combat obesity. And how can we help them improve their life and reduce their body weight, reduce their fat mass, and improve their standard of living and quality of life.
Alexandria, many thanks for sharing all these insights from your research, and all the best for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.